The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar presented by HSG. Our webinar today is entitled The Pandemic and Strategy, Implications for Your Employed Physician Network. Before we begin, I have just two housekeeping items. If you want to submit questions via the webinar questions tab on your control panel, you can go ahead and do that, and we will answer as many as possible at the end of the webinar. We won't identify names or affiliations of those submitting questions, so you can keep that in mind. And then the second thing is that today's event will be available for on-demand viewing at hsgadvisors.com. And everyone who is attending today will also get a link to both the video and the slides, and that should happen in the next day or two. So with that being taken care of, we can go ahead and get started. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with HSG, we focus almost exclusively on employed provider networks, and we do a variety of consulting work related to those networks. So that includes things in our physician strategy bucket in terms of strategy for employed group networks, manpower development strategy, market and growth strategy, all that stuff rolled up into there. We do a lot of performance improvement work, so we'll do assessments identifying opportunities for improvement, and then we'll do implementation around those opportunities. We do physician leadership work, a lot of work on the shared vision and culture development, also a lot of work in terms of physician governance and leadership structures. We do analytics around network integrity, including patient flow to and from providers, network leakage and keepage, all of those things around network integrity. We also do a lot of work around physician compensation, including compensation plan design and fair market values and commercial reasonableness opinions. A lot of our expertise and viewpoints around employed groups is represented in our book, published in December of 2018 by by the Healthcare Administration Press. The book discusses our framework for the evolution of employed networks, and it really categorizes how organizations experience a familiar cycle of phases as their networks develop and mature. That book is authored by Travis Ansel, Terry McWilliams, and just so happens our co-host for today's webinar, David Miller, who's also the founding partner of HSG. David, do you have any words of greeting for the folks at home?
No, just looking forward to their questions and insights as we talk about strategy and the pandemic.
Sounds great. So one final thing to share is that David just had an article recently published in Modern Healthcare Online, really talking about how our belief of the focus of successful organizations needs to shift to the employed physician enterprise. So much so in the past there's been so much focus on the hospital side, but our belief is that focus needs to shift onto the employed physician network side of things. So without much further ado, we can kind of dive into it a little more, because you can really see that we spend a lot of time living, breathing, and writing about employed physician networks, and that has certainly been true these last few weeks as we've kind of dealt with the development and onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we've spent plenty of time thinking about it, learning from clients, and helping clients address the pandemic from a lot of different angles, because really from an operational and a financial perspective, there's a lot to figure out. And on our COVID resource library, we have a checklist that deals with a lot of all of the clinical and operational challenges, all of the financial challenges that are, represent fires that are kind of right in front of people's faces. So addressing these challenges is something that everybody needs to do. Any organization that's going to survive to the end of the year needs to address and overcome these challenges. But today we're going to spend more time talking about the emerging strategic challenges, because our opinion is that organizations who properly address these challenges are going to be the same organizations that win their market over the next 5 years. And one very relevant example in the healthcare sphere is looking at Ochsner Health System in New Orleans, kind of before, during, and after Katrina. And if you've attended other webinars by HSG, you've probably heard us mention this and talk about this. I know Dr. Terry McWilliams had a webinar where he talked a little bit about this case study as well, but we think it really represents an organization who took a step back at the proper time and thought about the strategy despite all the chaos around them. So if we think about Ochsner Health System before Katrina, it was single hospital, 500 physicians employed by Ochsner. And then you think about Katrina rolling through, and you think about just the sheer number of operational and huge challenges that were faced by not only Ochsner but all hospitals in that region that were affected. And you think about those operational challenges of flooding, supply shortages, power outages. I mean, huge things. And it would have been really easy to exclusively focus on those things. But Ochsner took a step back and they said, hey, we have an opportunity to work with new physicians, to work with new hospitals. And instead of resigning to the fact that there's all these operational issues that they need to overcome, and instead of saying, hey, we don't have time to focus on the future, we don't have time to focus on strategy, they actually partnered with independent physicians, acquired hospitals even, and they did that from a strategic point of view. And if you fast forward 10 years after Katrina, they saw benefits in huge ways in terms of they now have more than 25 hospitals that they either own, manage, or are affiliated with. The size of the employee group doubled from 500 to more than 12,000 or 1,200. And they have tons more affiliated physicians as well. And so revenue, profitability, all of those metrics followed along as well. And there's tons and tons of case studies and examples out there. So if you spend any time Googling, you can learn a lot of details in terms of how they were able to step back, think about strategy, and see the dividends pay off in years to come. And so really that's our goal for today, is to begin to help organizations step back, address the strategic items that will really set them up for success in the future. And so we're tying a few things together. I mean, as we help kind of prioritize those issues and think about what issues need to bubble up to the top, we're tying in, not only observations from our conversations with clients and our work with clients and our expertise, but we're also tying in initial results from a survey we put out, the HSG's COVID-19 Strategic Impact Survey. And today we're sharing results from about 50 health system and employee group leaders. That survey will remain open to take through the end of the week. So if anybody wants to take that survey, the link will be included in these slides that you receive. So with that being said, feel free to go and take that survey. And so moving on, as we start to, again, think about those priorities and think about what needs to bubble up to the top from a strategic point of view, we have a few observations, and really as we divide those observations and priorities into short-term and long-term, we do find there are a few short-term strategic imperatives that must be addressed, specifically redesigning care models for the pandemic. Number two, convincing consumers that care environments are safe. And then underscoring both those is the need to engage physician leaders in those endeavors. So first, diving into redesigning care models for the pandemic. And this is something that, borders up against operations, and certainly from an operational point of view, a lot of organizations have been reactive and done some of these things already, but it's also a moment to be strategic and kind of codify some of those changes, think more strategically about, what the next 9 months are going to look like around creating those discrete care pathways for patients with and without COVID. So that involves, segregating patients in the emergency room, starting patient testing prior to elective procedures, looking at primary care and specialty offices, and figuring out if you want to aggregate COVID patients or steer patients to one set of offices versus another. And then we've seen organizations, start to think about virtual screening before any inpatient visits and things of that nature. So all those things need to be, not only codified, but also evaluated, and not only from a point of view of clinical soundness, which is imperative, but also from a point of view of the patient, and what is the likelihood that the patients will be satisfied with those pathways and be satisfied that they are safe, which moves into that second issue of convincing consumers that care environments are safe. And that represents a huge marketing challenge and a big desire and a big need to get the right marketing message and delivering that message to targeted patients, to the community at large. And really, we believe there's an opportunity to kind of address the fear head on and develop the right message about safety initiatives and ensure that patients feel good about their alternatives for seeking care. David, anything to add on those short-term items before we talk about the longer-term stuff?
I mean, I would just add that obviously I'm not traveling much and seeing many markets right now, but I'm not seeing nearly as much effort to convince consumers that environments are safe as it seems like I should be. I know the health system that I use predominantly, because that's where my primary care physician is, I've gotten no messages from them about what they're doing to make sure I feel comfortable going to the office and that sort of thing. And as we've talked to clients, I've got to say that's an issue that hasn't come up much. I mean, there's going to be a message on the websites of a lot of health systems, but I don't think it's gotten enough focus personally. It seems like a tremendous barrier to beginning to build volume again and to get people to come in for physician visits and elective procedures and all sorts of stuff. So that's the issue, I think, in the short term, seems to me like to be the biggest strategic challenge.
Makes sense. Okay. So with that being said, David, I'll turn it over to you to talk more about the longer term opportunities.
So as we've, as Eric noted, talked to clients, as we've looked at literature, as we've thought about the strategic challenges health systems were facing and how those relate to their employed networks, there are really 5 things that have kind of popped out at us and we think are worthy of attention right now. And before I get to that, let me talk a little bit about the employed network focus of our book, which, as Eric noted, talks about how groups need to evolve, starting in the beginning with hospitals that are employing doctors and don't have a clue what they're doing. They're really novices, to health systems that have an employed physician network that can manage risk and manage care and produce somewhat reliable outcomes, whether those are clinical quality or cost. And I think one of the big opportunities here is that with that longer term vision in mind for the mature group that can really manage risk contracts, this is a strategic opportunity to change the groups with that focus in mind. And so that's one of the bullets on this slide 14. I mean, obviously a big challenge organizations are facing is the care process redesign across their network. So we've got clients with hundreds and hundreds of physicians employed. And for every one of those physicians, the way they provide care is changing a little bit. Some of them, it's changing a lot because of virtual visits. So we see that as a challenge, and we'll talk more about each of these later. We kind of highlighted primary care because there have been more challenges in primary care than in most specialty care models, because so many patients are asking to use virtual visits or just flat out staying away. And so we want to talk about that a little bit. The portfolio of practices in the network, who's in and who's out, there's strategic opportunities related to that. as health systems have struggled financially through the first 2 months of this pandemic, largely because patients are staying away for elective procedures, and so revenue's down substantially. Always a good opportunity and a good time for the health system to use that as an excuse to really look at their expense structure, but also not lose sight of revenue in the process. And then finally, to build on a point I made a minute ago, kind of doing all this with an eye toward building a group that can do risk contracting. One of the things Eric noted when he talked about the services we provide, a lot of our strong belief is that physician leaders have to be engaged in all this. If we're going to really look at the expense structure, if we're really going to look at who's in and who's out, if we're going to look at care processes, obviously physician leaders have to be engaged in all those discussions. So while it's not mentioned as a key strategy, it's kind of a foundational element from our perspective of any restructuring you might do, and something you always need to have front and center, because the physicians can be your allies in doing this, or you can make them enemies if you don't manage it well and don't engage them well. So that's obviously a key point. Next slide, thank you. Around care redesign across the network, there are two big questions that we see organizations beginning to try to wrestle with. One is, how will virtual care be integrated into the care processes? And something that, as we jokingly say, everybody had a 2-year plan for virtual visits and they implemented it in 2 weeks. Necessity being the mother of invention, and the feds also loosening some of the regulations around that issue as well. But we think physicians need to have serious conversations about when direct patient contact is really needed, and in what scenarios can we provide care virtually, and when do we need to lay the hands on the patients and see them directly. And I would say there's a lot of resistance to change within the physician culture over this, although a lot of that resistance has been undercut by the current necessities. So the pandemic has really opened up a lot of opportunities and expanded people's thinking about when virtual visits could be productive. The other question is, where should face-to-face care be delivered? So part of the care redesign is about where geographically you provide services, and we've got some clients that are saying we're going to move more surgery from inpatient to outpatient, and we're going to move it from outpatient on campus to outpatient off the hospital campus, focusing more on patients' perception and safety as they make those moves. I think there are going to be opportunities for more digital technology, which obviously are slowly developing and are out there and are potential disruptors of care models. But that may change the way care is delivered as well. And we've seen a lot of hospitals take services out of physician offices and centralize them in the hospital so they could get hospital rates. Even if it was a little less convenient for the patient, it allowed for a better economic model. And we think the pandemic may upset some of that thinking and cause some of those services to be pushed back into the physician offices as well. As Eric alluded to, we've done a survey on some of these issues with a number of health systems, and some of the questions relate to this issue about the way care is delivered. We've asked people to, on a scale of from strongly disagree to strongly agree, what their opinion was about a couple of issues here. One is the delivery of virtual visits will be a key part of our strategy after COVID-19, and 94% of the organizations say that they strongly agree with that. And I think it's a situation that once patients figure out that they can do it and that they're comfortable with it, and they don't have to get in their car and go to the office and deal with all that, they can do it from their home or from an office to receive care. I think this horse is out of the barn, and these people are right. They're going to have to develop care systems that address that issue.
Yeah, and David, I'll just add, I mean, I think that's the exact result we were anticipating when we put the question in, because just from hearing so many conversations with clients about the exact issue you said, that they've basically accelerated their virtual visit strategy in a way that was, not even conceivable 6 months ago. When, more than 90% having agreement and almost 60% strongly agreeing. I mean, that's that, in terms of any survey we've sent out, that's about as strong of an answer as we've ever seen on any sort of question, COVID or not. And really, even though it's that strong, I'm not even sure we were that surprised by that result.
And to put in a plug for a friend of the firm, we've got a attorney with Hall Render who we do some work with from time to time, a fellow named Chris Eads, and his practice largely relates around virtual medicine and various state regulations and laws around that, and how to deal with HIPAA under virtual medicine models. And Chris said he sent out an invitation to a webinar on virtual medicine and the legal restrictions around that. And he sent it out 4 days before the webinar, and he had 1,200 people sign up. We've got interest in this topic, but we don't have 1,200 people's worth of interest. But I think it just is indicative of how quickly people have focused on that issue. The second question was more about shifting services to ambulatory settings and moving patients away. This is a little bit more of a bell curve, but it's clearly weighted somewhat toward the agree side of the equation. And again, for our clients who are thinking about this, it's really driven by the patient's perceptions of safety within a hospital environment. And if all the people with this virus are all the sick people with this virus are going to hospitals, do I really want to go there to receive care? I had a physician say to me last week, if I was getting an elective endoscopy, I wouldn't do it right now. I'd delay it till fall. And I might, if we have a second outburst, I might delay it further. So I think that's what you're seeing reflected here. And it's not a thought process that seems irrational that hospitals should be thinking about moving some of those services. Eric, I don't know if you have questions on that comment or not.
I don't, nope.
Okay. So, implications of all this. First of all, I think virtual visits will be more productive for providers. The primary care providers I've talked to in particular have said that, yeah, they can do them quicker than they can do on-site visits. And I guess you eliminate a lot of the need for support staff like medical assistants, because you're not checking blood pressures and pulses and that sort of stuff before the visit. And so, there's some greater productivity that comes out of this. We think it's also has the potential to improve the patient experience. I've done a few virtual visits myself when I had minor issues, and it's pretty slick if you can handle it in 4 minutes instead of the hour and 20 minutes it would take to go to my primary care doctor's office and deal with that system. It may cause hospitals and health systems to divest some assets that they need and look at different assets and under a new care model. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through the presentation. I also think it's going to create care coordination challenges because as you add incremental resources, as you have patient care provided in more diverse environments, it's the chance for things to get disjointed is clearly there. So for health systems, they're going to have to think about that issue as they design and redesign the way care is delivered. Jumping ahead to the implications or to the primary care in particular, I don't know if your organizations have had this experience, but it's not uncommon for us to hear that the primary care offices have experienced a precipitous decline in volume. 50% is the number I see most often. I think after Kentucky, after Louisville closed up and we started stay-at-home orders and that sort of stuff, the primary care doctors I've talked to said they still had 2 or 3 patients walking into the office each day, but the volume didn't really go back up until they got their virtual system set up. And then it was back to 50 to 65% of the volume. And so I think that trend is probably here to stay. I think one implication of this is there are a lot of companies doing virtual visits, or insurance companies included, doing virtual visits as a freestanding business. And most primary care providers were not providing virtual visits. I think this is going to upset that apple cart and change that dynamic, so that primary care physicians with an office who've traditionally seen patients face-to-face are going to need to provide virtual visits to survive, which may undermine the basic care model of these firms that were just specializing in virtual visits. I think because your primary care physician is going to be providing that, you'll probably have a little better coordination of care and potentially a little better care as well. And there's an opportunity here, going back to my comment earlier about risk contracting, about thinking about this from a risk contracting perspective. And I have no doubt virtual visits will make providers more efficient. If you go back and look at the data, Kaiser passed the midpoint where half of their visits were virtual a couple of years ago. And so they're obviously doing that from a risk contracting, management of capitation perspective. And so I think this creates a new opportunity in the primary care model to do that. The other question it creates is and you can stay here, yeah, is now that there's no money in the primary care offices, where is that money? Well, it's all in the insurance company. They're all sitting on the cash because they've been collecting the premiums, but not paying for the patients to be seen by physicians. So we are seeing some organizations, some insurance organizations, fronting money to primary care physicians. I saw that Blue Cross of Arizona was doing that earlier this week. They announced they were willing to do that. So some changes in business because of that as well. Implications of this, I think, first of all, it's good news for primary care access. If providers are more productive, there's a greater chance that you can get to see your own doctor without, and that has implications for urgent care and retail-based clinics, which sometimes get overflow because patients can't get in to see their own physician. I also personally, although none of the people in our survey, or not many of our people in our survey, thought this was true, it has the potential to lessen the need for advanced practitioners. If the physicians that you're employing can see more patients, it seems to me like the demand for APPs in primary care offices potentially could go down. So something the health systems and the doctors need to do is think about how they benefit from the improved economics of this, which if you're charging fee for service, I'm not sure how they do benefit from the increased efficiency. If you're in a capitated arrangement, maybe you can. I've seen some discussion in the marketplace about whether virtual visits mitigates the need for diverse primary care locations. Some of these are questions we were posing to then address, but we don't really think it does. The patients who are going to be least adaptive to virtual visits, the older people who are less technologically savvy, that's like me versus Eric, or poorer people who have transportation problems but also have connectivity problems with the internet, that doing virtual visits may be harder for those people, and they're still going to want resources close to home. So we don't think it's going to change that appreciably. I've already talked about urgent care. I do think, again, this undercuts the business model that is, we just provide virtual visits, because if your own primary care physician is providing them as well, it creates a lot of competition in that space. And then I think it's important, again, getting back to the marketing messages from health systems to push that competitive advantage. So those are some of the implications we see. We have next, evaluating your portfolio of practices. So this creates two interesting opportunities. I think the financial stress health systems are under gets them to cut the dead wood out of their physician networks and probably makes it easier for them to do that. This is articulated as getting rid of physicians who are poor quality or minimal volume. Minimal volume maybe are people who can't build a practice because they don't have the bedside manner or other skills to do so. It also helps you cut out people that are not important to your strategy or not important to your community health goals. So this kind of creates an opportunity to cut out some of that dead wood, some of the people that are not as important to you. But probably the more important alternative or strategy, and this goes back to the Ochsner discussion Eric talked about in the beginning, is the opportunity to acquire some doctors who you maybe covet, who may be important to you strategically, but have been disinterested in being employed by a hospital and health system. Also private practices that have gotten into competition with the hospital or health system. We have one client, and I called the CFO and said, once you get past the initial shock of what's going on, once you've defined if and who you're going to furlough and who you're going to lay off and how you're going to cut costs to manage in the current environment, you need to immediately turn your attention to these two groups in your community. They may be struggling financially. They probably pay out a lot of the profits and take them home for the physician investors. So they may have a horrid cash flow problem right now that is going to force them to think about whether or not they have to sell out. And if they do sell, it needs to be to you, the local health system, not your competitor in the market, not another for-profit that's private equity funded. You need to be knocking on their door and talking to them about this. Obviously, that strategy is limited to people, health systems that are financially strong, but there are plenty of those out there. So we think that's a great strategy to pursue. We asked a couple of questions on our survey related to this. And Eric, do you want to talk about these survey questions or?
Yeah, sure. So basically, in terms of everything David was just talking about, we asked two questions on the survey. One, how likely is your organization to acquire independent practices within your market as a result of COVID-19? And the genesis behind that question is everything David just said. You know, we were anticipating, based on what we're seeing, what we are hearing, that this is probably going to be a rough time for private practices, and those private practices might be reaching out to the hospitals. And we also were anticipating that hospitals who, you know, are able to put a strategic cap on right now might be able to proactively reach out to those practices as well. So I think when we sent the survey, we were maybe anticipating a little more in the likely, extremely likely, and somewhat likely. Because as you can see, it's a pretty even distribution. There's almost just as many people who are kind of saying, hey, we're not likely to acquire practices as a result of all this, as there are people who are saying we are, you know, extremely and somewhat likely. And of course, there's, you know, a whole group of people kind of in this neutral category. But you know, our approach is, or our belief is, that the people in this category, assuming they have the capital to do it, are more likely over the long run to be better off because they'll come out of this a little tight with more alignment with a broader group of employed physicians. When we unpack the survey results, because in addition to, you know, some of these agree and disagree boxes that people could check, we left room for you know, comments and things like that. And when we unpacked the unlikely responses, there were a lot of people commenting, you know, about the availability of capital, and you know, as dire as it might be for private practices, hospitals and health systems might just not have the financial wherewithal or the capital to invest. So that was one area where, as David said, for those that have the capital, it could represent some strong opportunities. A very related question is we asked, how likely is your organization to take advantage of regulatory waivers related to Stark provisions in order to support independent practices within your market? And I won't go into all those right now. But Terry McWilliams and Neil Barker from our firm have done webinars that kind of touch more on that. But as CMS has kind of rolled out waivers and rolled out various things to provide relief during COVID, one of the things that they did was kind of create some waivers for Stark. So that actually allows hospitals and health systems to provide financial support to struggling practices. And so that's kind of a shade less than full employment, but being able to provide that assistance without having an employment relationship when this is all up. So there's a lot of regulatory things tied up in that I won't go into. However, it is interesting to look at the distribution of results, because there's a lot more respondents who were a little unsure maybe what we meant or what their plans were by that, but the level of agreement was pretty similar, not quite as many in that extremely likely category, but a lot more in the somewhat likely. So, we were maybe surprised to see these numbers so high, because we thought if hospitals and healthcare systems were going to spend the capital or the cash to support private practices, it probably would make sense to do it in an employment capacity, where then you could have long-term benefits and alignment versus kind of the short-term financial assistance that would end when the pandemic is over. So that was little interesting results there, but worth a share.
And the next slide, which also related to the survey, was about provider recruitment, which we found interesting. And we really asked a couple of questions. One, do you anticipate this impacting your physician recruitment plans over the next 2 years? A strong minority, 43%, said yes, we do think it's going to change our improvement plans. So then we asked some questions about how is that going to change? Is it going to change your recruitment of specialists? Is it going to change your recruitment of primary care physicians, et cetera? And despite my predictions to the contrary, the biggest growth where there was going to be more recruitment was advanced practitioners. And so probably our suspicion is that that's probably because they're cheaper and there's maybe less financial risk in adding them than adding a physician. There was a strong feeling that fewer specialists, whether those are medical or surgical specialists, were needed. 89 and 90% of the people who responded to the survey said that they think it's less likely that they're going to recruit specialists. I think that's maybe something that will change as we come out of this. But when all your specialists who are involved in elective procedures are sitting around twiddling their thumbs and staring at you, it's probably hard to conceptualize why you would need to recruit more of those. Eric, you have any more comments on that slide?
I think the only additional comment is that obviously the makeup of the network and the portfolio of practices within your employed enterprise has a lot to do with the cost structure of that, which is a topic we are about to talk about. But I think here, I think this might be reflective of people being worried about their cost structure and people anticipating even further scrutiny over the losses on the employed network. And certainly as you whittle down the number of specialists and increase the number of primary care advanced practitioner, that's going to have profound impact and effects on your cost per provider and your overall cost structure in your network, and therefore the losses on your network too. So I think this might be some people being cost conscious, with the caveat that there's still more people than not that said, hey, our recruitment plans are going to go on just like COVID didn't happen, which is important for us. As I mentioned earlier, we do a lot of physician manpower strategies, and so that's an interesting result that we've been incorporating into that work too, to say, hey, if if you're going to take your foot off the gas in terms of recruitment, there's plenty of other organizations who are, not going to and might end up with the docs that they're going to need into the future, and you might not. So I think that has implications as well.
So we started out talking about the evaluation of your portfolio of practices, and I'm just summarize. This is a chance to build the network you need for the long term. The network you need to manage risk, the network you need to manage community health, the network you need to compete with other organizations. And so combined with some private practices who could be valuable to you in those three arenas, potentially being available to you, with the reality that nobody's going to much bat an eye if you cull and trim your current group and get rid of some of the deadwood because of the financial pressures that are right now. This is a great opportunity to deal with those two issues. The next issue is, and Eric teed this up already, but is looking at expense structure, and with the deterioration of financial performance and the eating into investments and the drop in value in the stock market, we expect everybody to be worried, concerned about this issue. I was on a virtual strategic planning committee meeting earlier today, and the losses in the physician network, or the subsidy of the physician network, got a lot more attention than it would have if we had had the meeting three months ago, because people are looking at everything, trying to figure out how they can make the economics work. So I think you're going to see a deterioration of payer mix. The privately insured patients are going to go down in number. Some of the people who are insured are going to be underinsured and are going to be very price sensitive. And so focusing on a number of the network expense items is a strategically important issue these days. Most of the money in employed networks goes to the physicians and other providers. So compensation and productivity, those two groups are really key. The productivity and staffing around non-provider is important. Although I got to say that if you cut that too lean, then you can't put throughput through the practices. And so you're penny wise and pound foolish. You got to spend some money on that. And then we've already talked about right sizing the network and getting rid of the people that maybe are not strategically important to you or whatever. But all of those are issues that we see organizations needing to tackle right now. We did in the survey ask people about the comp issue more than anything, because as soon as this happened, we started getting calls from people saying, what do you think we ought to be doing? And we had some thoughts, but often the answer to that question relates to what the competitive market is, how hard you've had to fight to build your network, and are you willing to let it fall apart over a short-term issue, and some of that sort of thing. So we did ask people really two things. Have you made temporary changes to your compensation, and do you plan permanent changes to your compensation? The majority of people, a small majority, said no. They haven't really made any changes to their compensation. So that was 53%. The next biggest cohort, yes, says we've reduced compensation for at least some of our providers. And then some smaller people were making a little bit more significant changes. Eric, you may have more comments about this slide because you put it together, so I'll let you talk about it if you want to.
Well, and I guess my first comment is if the percentages add up to more than 100, it's because sometimes people could check multiple boxes. So sometimes people are doing, multiple different things. But I think the thing that struck me was probably on the question where we asked, do you anticipate needing to make permanent changes to provider compensation? Only about 40% were definitive enough to say, no, we know we're going to go back to using the same models as before. Where it's, even though that's the biggest total, that still says 60% of people out there are anticipating or unsure if they need to change their provider compensation plans. And I think, again, that just ties into everything we've been talking about, in terms of where we land from a cost structure point of view, where we land from a volume and revenue point of view, and really what the incentives need to be. I think for so many organizations, that's still up in the air. and something that, it relates to recruitment, it relates to provider retention. I think now it's probably okay that almost a third of people are unsure where they want to go with their provider compensation plans. But the longer we move on, the more uncertainty there is around that, the probably worse that is for the organization, because that's something that while it's okay to have a little uncertainty now, might create some consternation, unless they can answer the question to their providers, to their recruits, about what compensation models are going to look like in the future. So that was kind of one thing that stuck out to me.
And we've had clients all over the board. We've had clients who said, yeah, we've guaranteed compensation at the current level at this point. We've had clients who, because of their cash situation and the day's cash on hand, have had to furlough providers. So, I mean, that's obviously a tough decision to make. And if you can avoid it, is worth trying to avoid, because you could lose those providers and you may need them for the long run. Hospital executives, being who they are, they often get focused on expenses but less on revenue. Focus on FTEs and that sort of thing when they maybe should be focusing on other things. So a lot of what we do normally with clients on their financial performance is around volume and throughput, and making sure clients have good access, or patients have good access, and looking at revenue cycle issues and coding issues and payer rates. I mean, all those apply in spades right now. And, if you've got revenue cycle problems, or you suspect you do, this is probably the time to be tackling those sorts of issues. The first bullet about rebuilding volume, we ask a question on the survey related to that. And this is a question about how quickly does your organization anticipate returning to pre-pandemic volumes. I guess we didn't give them a chance to say never. But the majority of people think it's going to be 90, up to 90 days, or even 180 days. So the big numbers in the middle. And I guess this could be affected by having a reemergence of the virus, that sort of thing. That could longer term impact volume. I think that's why I'm so focused on communicating to patients what you've done to make your environment safe, and pounding on that message through promotional efforts, through social media efforts, through direct communication with patients, because I think that'll help you weather another outbreak if they feel like you've got a plan that segregates patients who have the virus versus those who don't, who create, you create different entry paths, or concentrate those COVID patients in certain practices, that sort of thing. So that seems critical to me. You sound like you have a comment, Eric.
I do. So we actually did give an option for people to say we will never return to pre-pandemic volume levels, and actually nobody picked it.
Okay.
So I'm more surprised about that than I am the 2% of people who said that their volume has not decreased as a result of COVID. And I'm sure a lot of people on the call are pretty interested in who those people are, and maybe envious of either where they are, what market they're in, or the type of organization they are, that they can confidently say they haven't seen a decrease in volume, because from our point of view, that's pretty rare.
Go ahead.
Even 2% seemed high to me. is what I'm trying to say.
Yep. So the implications of all this are obvious. I mean, the financial health of the organization is going to depend on responding to this. I've beat on the physician leadership issue previously, but I think if you're going to convince a group of physicians, you need some of their peers helping you carry the water and helping you sell this new reality. And so that's always sound advice when dealing with doctors under any scenario. I think going back to the care model transitions and building virtual visits becomes important. And one thing we're scratching our heads about is, how does the post-pandemic benchmarking compare to what was going on pre-pandemic? But underlying all that, just better information. and we expect to see people investing in better information about their practices, building better dashboards about their practices, looking at the flow and leakage out of their practices, and using expertise. We think people with expertise in certain areas around those issues will grow as well. Next slide addresses something that's near and dear to my heart, which is risk contracting, which short term probably makes absolutely no sense, because many of you are going to have a surge of patients as elective cases limits have been lifted. You're going to see a lot of patients, so it's probably a bad bet to do a per member per month deal under that. However, I think longer term, this is a good issue to at least consider. I mean, organizations who are being paid on per capita basis saw no decline in revenue, because the decline in revenue related to fewer patients and fewer fee-for-service encounters. And so avoiding financial struggles long-term capitation or looking at risk contracting may help with that. But I think it's a philosophical issue, and obviously a lot of healthcare organizations have tried to get into the insurance business and failed miserably. But if it's something that your organization begins to think makes sense long term, putting together the resources to manage that, putting your toe in the water on plans like Medicare Advantage that maybe offer one-sided risk, back to the ACOs that offer one-sided risk, may make sense as well. And as we get more virtual health visits and more advanced practitioners, your ability to manage within a premium dollar ought to grow. And so it's something to consider. We ask in the survey, has this made you think about this anymore? Are you exploring risk contracting and capitation alternatives as a result of decreased elective volume? Everybody pretty much said, no, we hadn't even thought about that. And under the current pressure with people not really having that skill, I guess it's not a surprise that very few people said, yeah, that was high on their list of priorities. I think one reason we think about it is, if you go back to the book we were talking about, the final phase in developing an effective physician network is developing one that can take on risk contracting, that is so confident in their processes and the way they provide care, and are doing it in such a consistent manner based on best practices, that they have pretty reliable results when it comes to cost and quality. And so that to us is the holy grail. And so that's probably why we asked this question and why we were hoping to see more people thinking about it. Eric, I don't know if you have comments on that or not.
Just one, the percentage of people who said unsure was the highest for this question than it was for kind of these other, do you agree or disagree with these kind of, overall strategy statements. And I think that just goes back to, somebody thinking this far ahead at this point in time is just, I think, less likely than some of the other ones, which, don't maybe seem so far-fetched. But so I think, just given where people's mindsets are now, maybe a little tougher for them to think about. But David, I very much agree with you that probably doesn't mean that it's something that should be written off.
So the implications of focusing more on this is it gives you a chance to move up the food chain closer to the premium dollar. Something that we think is really important is it increases your opportunities for direct contracting with employers in the market. I mean, they have privately insured employees, obviously. And every dollar most hospitals in this country make is off privately insured patients. So it increases your ability to go in and do direct contracting, and you don't necessarily have to take the risk. They can have reinsurance, but if you have you can reliably produce cost and outcomes, it makes you more attractive to an employer. I've already mentioned Medicare Advantage, and we have a number of clients doing well under Medicare Advantage risk contracting. We have a number doing poorly, but it's a cheap way to figure out how efficient your doctors are and figure out whether they're spending a lot of money or not. We have clients who have relationships with Medicare Advantage plans that say if the medical loss ratio is less than 85%, we'll share the savings with the providers. And that's a pretty good way to gauge where you are. But obviously, there's a lot of potential for failure, and a lot of people have failed at this endeavor. I'm going to turn it back to Eric to talk about the last couple of slides, and then we'll address any questions you may have.
Yeah, and I think really just to recap to say, I mean, I know a lot of the stuff we're talking about maybe seems far-fetched to say, hey, why would we talk about some of these things when, we have all these fires immediately in front of us? But just to reiterate, we're not saying don't think about the clinical and operational issues. Don't think about the financial issues. That's not what we're saying. Everybody's thinking about those. What we're saying is to differentiate yourself, over the next 5 or more years. It's these strategic things that, the more you can carve out time to think about and to solve is, the more going to make you more likely to succeed. We do have, before we get into questions, we have a few, and so we want to leave a few minutes for questions. But before we do that, I do want to just plug some upcoming webinars. Because clients have kind of been clamoring for information lately, we have gotten into a pretty aggressive webinar schedule, so you can follow this link to sign up for any of these upcoming webinars. The next one on the docket is a week from today, and it's reducing employed physician losses. We talked a lot about that and kind of why it's important, and you can see others that are coming up as well. So just wanted to make a plug for those. And then in terms of questions, we did get a few questions. One asks, can you discern if those who are changing compensation were independent hospitals or smaller systems? And we in terms of the survey data, which I'll address first, we kind of, to the extent that people, told us who they were, what organizations they were part of, and not everybody did, but to the extent that people did, we tried to piece together some patterns to see if anybody was answering in a certain way, or if organizations who were similar to another were more likely to answer one way or another. And there wasn't a lot of patterns to discern. So really, people were all over the board. I mean, whether they were an independent hospital, a big system, a small system, didn't really seem to have a big impact on how people were answering any questions, and those compensation questions included. So sorry, I don't have a more definitive answer on that, but that's kind of what it is. David, I guess as we're talking to people, as we're just helping clients, I guess from a non-survey, but more of an observational point of view, are you seeing any patterns in terms of independent systems versus smaller, independent hospitals versus smaller systems, and how they're dealing with compensation?
I guess I would say independent hospitals are probably on average more financially weak. And so I would say independent hospitals have tended to be a little bit more aggressive in that arena. I guess I have seen some systems that are financially strong be aggressive too. And it depends on how much real accountability they push down to the local market where they have an employed network. And if those people have strong, clear objectives related to the profitability, et cetera, the system is supporting them and making some changes as well. That's not scientific, but that's an observation I have.
And then another question, we'll probably only have time for one more, but this relates to our conversation about patient perception around feeling safe and secure. And the question was, what are some best practices to create safe environments without wasting PPE to help patients, staff, and providers feel more secure? David, I'll let you.
I wish we had Dr. McWilliams here to address this. He may be
Exactly.
listening. But, the things I've seen people do are to create clear rules that they communicated to patients before the visits. You've got to wear masks. The door of the office is going to be locked. You have to call and talk to us. before you come in. We're discouraging people from sitting in the waiting room. So even sitting in your car until you get a call and we're ready to see you in the office. That type of thing is the type of thing that pops to my mind. But Eric, I don't know if you have other observations, but that, I guess the other thing is that we've seen ERs segregate admissions. So we've seen people put up tents outside of ERs where if you had X symptom, you got directed in a certain direction so you didn't contaminate everybody that was in the ER, and trying to create separate paths. I don't think that is a PPE waster, but those types of things are the things I've noticed that I think have been most effective. And I guess the other thing is communication. I know some physicians who have been communicating aggressively with their patients. They've posted what they've given to patients on Facebook, which is where I've seen it, because maybe they're friends on Facebook or something like that. But I've seen individual physicians, even employed by health systems, that have kind of taken it on themselves to communicate with their patients, make sure they had the right expectations and the right knowledge to the degree they could communicate that information. And so I think that's been effective as well.
All right, and we had some folks submit questions that we can't get to, but we'll try to send those folks emails or get with them individually to share our thoughts on the questions. But that's all the time we have today, and I've got a little script, sorry. And so we just want to thank you for participating in today's webinar. We hope that you'll join us for future webinar events. A list of upcoming webinars can be seen here, and you can register for all on our website currently. Please feel free to contact us directly or visit us at hsgadvisors.com. Again, thanks so much, everyone, for spending an hour with us. Hope it was helpful, and please have a great day.